Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on executing, monitoring, and controlling stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement processes begin with the Identify Stakeholders process, which is part of the Initiating Process group. Then comes Plan Stakeholder Engagement, part of the Planning Process group. And these we've covered already. And now it's time to cover the executing process of Manage Stakeholder Engagement and the monitoring and controlling process of Monitor Stakeholder Engagement. The Manage Stakeholder Engagement process has no real new artifacts as outputs. However, the Monitor Stakeholder Engagement process does have a primary output of work performance information, just as the other monitoring and controlling processes. The Manage Stakeholder Engagement process is about communicating and working with your stakeholders to make sure that you meet their needs and expectations. You should also proactively anticipate, as well as clarify and address issues that could come up, or that do come up. And you should be fostering appropriate stakeholder involvement in the project's decisions and activities. It's also important to ensure that your stakeholders understand the project risks, as well as, very importantly, how their contribution will enhance the success of the project. It's your responsibility as the project manager to make sure that you get the support and commitment that you need from stakeholders. And you should make stakeholder satisfaction a core project objective, alongside scope, schedule, and cost, and quality, and other key objectives. Stakeholder satisfaction should be right there in that list of key objectives. In fact, some would argue that stakeholder satisfaction is the most important project objective, if not the only project objective, because all of the others are subsidiary objectives to stakeholder satisfaction. Now let's take a look at the inputs to this process of Manage Stakeholder Engagement. What do you need to know in order to manage your stakeholders' engagement? First of all, you'll need the stakeholder register, because this gives you a list of who your stakeholders are and includes the analysis and categorization of these stakeholders, as well as individual preferences and expectations on the project. You'll of course need your stakeholder engagement plan, which has all of your rules and guidelines for how to engage stakeholders. Your communications management plan is very closely related to your stakeholder engagement plan, covering all of your communication rules and guidelines. Risk is an important factor for your stakeholders, so your risk management plan is also an input. Stakeholders will often introduce changes as well, and so your change management plan and change log are also inputs. In working with stakeholders, issues tend to come up, and so you'll need to update your issue log and your lessons learned register. Enterprise environmental factors that can affect your stakeholder engagement include your organization's culture, the political climate in your organization, and your organization's governance structure, policies around personnel administration, the risk thresholds of specific stakeholders, the established communication channels that you have within your organization, also global, regional, or local trends, practices, or habits when it comes to communication or engagement, and so on. The geographic distribution of your facilities and resources and your stakeholders can also be a big factor in how you can engage stakeholders. Something interesting to notice here is that this list of enterprise environmental factors is exactly the same as the list under Manage Communications, which simply underscores how related stakeholder engagement and communications really are. The organizational process assets that can influence your process of manage stakeholder engagement include your corporate policies and procedures, especially for issues, risk, change, and data management. Your corporate policies and procedures for how you should be handling social media, your corporate ethics, and security. Your organization's communication requirements, your organization's guidelines for how information should be developed, exchanged, stored, and retrieved, and I would add disposed of when the time is right, as well as historical information about managing stakeholders from previous similar projects, which you can find in your Lessons Learned repository. Notice that this list of organizational process assets is exactly the same as the list for Manage Communications. It's also very similar to the list for Monitor Communications in that the last 4 out of 5 of these items are the same. It's no surprise that at the top of the list of your tools and techniques for managed stakeholder engagement, you find expert judgment. Engaging stakeholders is crucial and can be rather tricky. Any expertise that you can find and consult with in order to improve your stakeholder engagement is definitely recommended, especially if you can find people who are already familiar with and have worked with key stakeholders on your project so that you can understand their needs and preferences, communication requirements, risk tolerances, and all of this much better, especially how they handle issues and risks. Next on the list you have communication skills. Your communications to your stakeholders should be personalized based on your stakeholder engagement plan and your stakeholder register and the analysis that you've already done. And your focus should be on receiving feedback from your stakeholders in whatever circumstance, whether it's in conversations face-to-face or in meetings or gathering information and feedback via surveys or what have you. Next, you have interpersonal and team skills, which will come in very handy, especially conflict management, the need to be aware of different cultures and politics in the organization, and your ability to observe and converse with people in order to become aware of issues and risks and needs. Next, you have ground rules, such as you find in your team charter, and meetings, including your project kickoff meeting, decision-making meetings, meetings to deal with specific issues and how to resolve them, lessons learned meetings, including retrospectives, sprint planning meetings for agile approaches, and status update meetings. As mentioned earlier, there are really no new project artifacts generated from the managed stakeholder engagement process. However, we do have some updates in that things can be changed and need to be changed. And some of these changes can require change requests that go through the Perform Integrated Change Control process in order to update baselined documents, such as your project management plan or any of your baselines, especially your stakeholder engagement plan and communications management plan in the case of managed stakeholder engagement. You'll also be updating your stakeholder register with new information about your stakeholders, your change log with changes, issue log with new issues that come up or changes to issues that have come up, and your lessons learned register with learnings about how to engage with your stakeholders. Now it's time to test your memory of the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques of managed stakeholder engagement. This time, let's start with the tools and techniques. They start with expert judgment, communication skills specifically focused around feedback, your interpersonal and team skills including conflict management, cultural awareness, negotiation, observation, conversation, and political awareness, your ground rules, and many different types of meetings. The inputs you'll need to manage your stakeholders include what should be at the top of the list, your stakeholder register, which includes all of the information about who your stakeholders are, the analysis you've done, and information about their preferences and expectations on the project, but also the plans for how you'll manage stakeholders and communications and risks, as well as information in your change and issue log that can include information that is connected to specific stakeholders who have raised issues or requested changes, and your lessons learned register. For outputs, no new ones, but of course, all sorts of things can be updated, especially your communications plan and your stakeholder engagement plan, as well as your change log and issue log and your stakeholder register, including your lessons learned register as well. And many of these will require a change request. And now we come to the monitor stakeholder engagement process. This process is about monitoring your stakeholder relationships and, as necessary, modifying your engagement strategies and plans in order to tailor your strategies to engage your stakeholders better. Notice that based on this definition, you can predict that change requests will be an output of this process. The primary input for monitor stakeholder engagement is your work performance data, specifically data regarding the level of support you're getting from your stakeholders, and this comes from your direct and manage project work process. Next, you have your stakeholder register, which you'll need to compare these results to see if they're matching up with what you already know about your stakeholders. Your risk register, your issue log, these can also contain information that is tied specifically to individual stakeholders. Your lessons learned register includes lessons that you've learned earlier on in this project that you should be applying later in the project. Also, your project communications that have been going out to all of your stakeholders are something that you should use as you're monitoring this engagement level. And of course, your stakeholder engagement plan, communications plan, and even your resource management plan, as these have all the rules and guidelines for how you'll be managing stakeholder engagement, communications, and your resources. And there are also some interesting enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Your enterprise environmental factors include your organizational culture, political climate, and governance structure, your organization's personnel administration policies, your stakeholders' risk thresholds, the established communication channels that you have in your organization, different global, regional, or local trends, practices, or habits regarding stakeholder engagement and communication, as well as the distribution across the globe of your facilities, resources, and stakeholders. Notice that this list is precisely the same as in Manage Stakeholder Engagement, which is also exactly the same as the list for Manage Communications, again emphasizing the similarity and the interconnectedness of communications and stakeholder engagement, as well as managing and monitoring stakeholder engagement. The list of organizational process assets that can affect monitor stakeholder engagement include your corporate policies and procedures for how you handle issues and risks, how you do change management, and how you manage data, your corporate policies and procedures for how you should be using social media, what your corporate ethics are, how you handle security, organizational communications requirements, your organization's guidelines for how information should be developed, exchanged, stored, retrieved, and disposed of, as well as historical information about stakeholders and their engagement from previous similar projects. And yes, you guessed it, this list of organizational process assets is exactly the same as the list for managed communications. And the last four are the same as monitor communications. And now we move on to some of the tools and techniques of the monitor stakeholder engagement process. As you're monitoring stakeholder engagement, you'll want to measure and keep an eye on any variances in your stakeholder engagement where stakeholders are not engaged at the level that you'd like them to be. And as you look at these variances, you'll want to consider different alternatives for how you can close this gap and engage the stakeholder better or more appropriately. This is called alternatives analysis. You'll also want to use some root cause analysis to see if you can get to the root of why the stakeholder is not engaging as you'd like them to. Once you come up with some alternatives, you can then make some decisions. And so you may need some decision-making skills and tools and techniques, such as multi-criteria decision analysis or voting, to choose on the best course of action to improve engagement. You also have stakeholder analysis, because you should be frequently and proactively reviewing your stakeholder analysis and keeping it up to date. Other tools and techniques include data representations, such as your stakeholder engagement assessment matrix, which can help you to visually see and review quickly where you want people to be in their engagement versus where they are, and to quickly identify any gaps. Also, communication skills, especially around getting feedback from your stakeholders, and your ability to provide information, including in presentations. Interpersonal and team skills, such as active listening, cultural and political awareness, will come in very handy, and networking and leadership skills. You'll also have several different types of meetings with stakeholders in which you can judge their engagement. And you'll notice that expert judgment is not on the list. And yet, it certainly could be, because as you have experts in these areas, such as in root cause analysis or alternatives analysis or communication skills or data representation or meetings and so on, you should be taking advantage of the advice of these experts. But again, remember that these lists are not meant to be exhaustive. So even though it's not on the list, doesn't mean it couldn't be used. As a reminder, here's what the Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix looks like. It's a very simple matrix which shows stakeholders and their level of engagement, both their current level of engagement and their desired level of engagement. And here you can quickly see the gaps between those stakeholders who are unaware or resistant, neutral, supportive, which is what you usually want, and leading. The outputs of monitor stakeholder engagement are primarily work performance information, which is the work performance data that you've received as an input to this process, then analyzed and categorized and summarized and so on to provide useful information that can be used in reports and decision making. Also, all of the necessary updates to your stakeholder register, your risk register, issue log, and lessons learned register, as well as change requests that are needed in order to make updates to your plans in your stakeholder engagement plan, communications management plan, and resource management plan. Now let's review the inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of monitor stakeholder engagement. Your inputs are primarily your work performance data that includes information about how well your stakeholders are engaging, but you can also get some of this information from your issue log and your risk register, perhaps even your project communications. And you'll need to follow the rules in your resource management plan, your communications management plan, and of course your stakeholder engagement plan. You may have some lessons learned that you want to consult as well. And you'll remember that the enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets are very similar to communications. The tools and techniques that you'll apply include various types of data analysis, such as considering your alternatives, finding root causes, and periodically reviewing your stakeholder analysis, decision-making, data representation, especially your assessment matrix of engagement, communication skills and interpersonal team skills, and meetings. Your outputs are primarily work performance information, change requests needed to make changes to your project management plans, and other updates to your project documents, such as your stakeholder register, risk register, issue log, and lessons learned register. A few key points to remember from the lesson are that stakeholder engagement is critical to project success, that you need to establish relationships with your stakeholders in order to understand their situation, their needs, their requirements, and expectations. And your communications need to be adapted to each stakeholder's preferences and needs. For more information, you can refer to these pages of the PMBOK guide. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.